The little black girl hid near the stairwell, asking the biker why her mom's chart was removed without explanation. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It all began in the dimly lit hallway of Mercy General Hospital. The quiet, almost oppressive air hung thick in the evening, the sound of footsteps echoing across the polished floors. A little black girl, no older than 8, stood trembling near the stairwell, her small frame pressed tightly against the wall. Her heart raced as she looked nervously toward the nurse's station. Her mother had been admitted earlier that day after a troubling fall. But now, the situation had taken a turn she could not understand. Her mother's chart had mysteriously disappeared, and no one would explain why. The girl could feel her stomach twist in knots. Why had they taken her mom's chart? She had heard the whispers between the nurses, the hushed tones, the strange looks. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it deep down in her bones. She had to know what was going on. That's when she saw him. A large man, wearing a worn leather jacket and looking like someone who had seen his share of tough times. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his face a mask of calm determination. He was a biker, someone who didn't belong in a hospital, but there he was, standing like an unspoken guardian, exuding an aura of strength and resolve. The little girl hesitated, unsure of what to do. She was scared, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of her dress, but something inside her urged her forward. She took a deep breath and walked toward him. Her voice was barely a whisper, shaky and filled with fear as she spoke. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her eyes wide with confusion and worry. "Why was my mom's chart taken away? Why won't they tell me what happened?" The biker's eyes softened as he looked down at her. He had seen plenty in his time, but this was different. His gaze flickered to the nurse's station and then back to the little girl. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't just another scared child. She was terrified, and she needed answers. He could sense the urgency, the need for protection. Without saying a word, he bent down to her level, making sure she could see the concern in his eyes. He promised himself he would find out what was going on, no matter the cost. "Let's figure this out together, kid," he said, his voice low but reassuring. The girl nodded, her relief visible as she felt the warmth of his presence. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her a sense of safety, a small spark of hope in the middle of her confusion. The biker stood up straight, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he surveyed the hospital. He knew something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence the truth. The girl's mother was in danger, and he was going to find out why. With a sense of purpose, he began to move, leading the little girl quietly through the halls, toward the unknown and whatever answers lay ahead. The biker led the little girl down the dimly lit hallway, his boots echoing against the polished floors. They moved with purpose, neither of them speaking, but the tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. The girl, still clutching her dress with one hand, looked up at him, her heart pounding. She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel it. Something was wrong. The biker, Jack, could sense it too. He had been around long enough to recognize when something was off. This wasn't just a case of a simple medical error. There was something deeper at play here. They turned a corner and approached a set of double doors that led to the administrative area. Jack stopped in front of them, turning to the girl. "Stay close to me," he said in a low voice. The girl nodded, her small form barely making a sound as she followed him. He pushed open the doors, and they stepped into a small office, the scent of paper and disinfectant hanging in the air. A nurse sat behind the desk, her eyes wide when she saw Jack. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight. Jack didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where's Maya Jenkins's chart?" he asked, his tone firm but calm. The nurse hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "I'm sorry, but I'm not authorized to discuss patient information," she replied. Jack's eyes narrowed. He had been around long enough to know when someone was lying, and the nurse's body language was all wrong. "I don't care about authorization," he said, stepping closer to the desk. "You're going to tell me what happened to that chart." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She was scared, but Jack's presence made her feel like someone was finally taking control. The nurse fidgeted, glancing nervously around the room before she spoke again. I don't know. It was taken off the records earlier today. Someone higher up. She was cut off as Jack stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Who? Who took it? The nurse swallowed, her gaze flickering to the door behind her. I don't know, but it's being handled, she muttered. Jack was done with the runaround. He turned to the little girl, who was now standing near the desk, her wide eyes watching the exchange. Go wait in the hallway, he said gently, not wanting her to see what was coming next. The girl hesitated, her small hands wringing the fabric of her dress. Please, don't leave me, she whispered, her voice shaking. Jack's heart twisted, but he kept his composure. I'm not leaving you, he said softly, kneeling down to her level. But I need you to stay in the hallway. It's going to be okay, I promise. With a reluctant nod, the girl turned and walked back toward the hallway, casting one last glance over her shoulder. Jack waited until she was out of sight before turning back to the nurse. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Something wasn't right, and he was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. You're going to help me, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. You're going to tell me everything you know about what's happening here. The nurse's face drained of color as she looked at Jack, realizing she had no choice. She let out a shaky breath before speaking again. There's a doctor. Dr. Patterson. He's the one who ordered the chart removal, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's mind raced as he processed the information. Dr. Patterson. That name didn't sit right with him. He had to find out who this doctor was and what he was hiding. Where can I find him? Jack asked, already moving toward the door. The nurse's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. He's in the staff lounge. But I don't think you should confront him. Her voice trailed off, fear creeping into her words. He's what? Jack pressed. The nurse hesitated before speaking again. He's connected. He has ties to people who don't take kindly to interference, she said, her voice shaking. Jack's jaw clenched. He had dealt with dangerous people before, but this was different. Whoever Dr. Patterson was working with, they were clearly involved in something shady. I'll handle it, Jack said, his voice cold with determination. He opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, looking down at the little girl, who was standing just a few feet away, still waiting patiently. He gave her a reassuring smile. Let's go get your mom back, he said, his voice steady. The girl's face brightened, a flicker of hope lighting up her eyes. As they walked down the hallway together, Jack's mind raced with questions. Why had Maya's chart been removed? What was Dr. Patterson hiding? And more importantly, how deep did this go? He had no answers yet, but he was determined to find out. And whoever was behind this, Jack was ready to take them on. Jack led the little girl down the narrow corridor of Mercy General Hospital, his boots tapping against the cold tiles as the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Maya's chart had been taken, and the hospital was doing everything it could to cover up the truth. There was no way he was going to let them get away with it. He glanced down at the girl walking beside him, her small hand clutching his jacket tightly. She had barely spoken since they left the office, her wide eyes full of fear and confusion. She didn't understand why her mother's chart was taken, or why she couldn't see her. Jack didn't have all the answers, but he promised himself he would find them. As they reached the staff lounge, Jack paused. He could hear voices inside. One of them was unmistakably Dr. Patterson's, and from the tone of the conversation, things were getting tense. Are you sure no one knows about the chart? Dr. Patterson's voice cut through the door, his words sharp and laced with irritation. Jack could hear another voice, low and cautious, respond. No, doctor. No one's seen it. It's secure. The first voice, Dr. Patterson's, grew more insistent. We need to keep it that way. If anyone finds out what's going on with that girl, we're done. You understand. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Whatever was going on, it was big, and Maya's chart was at the center of it. He had no intention of letting them sweep this under the rug. He turned to the little girl. Stay here, he whispered. I'll be right back. Don't worry. She nodded, her eyes wide as she took a small step back, trusting Jack even though she didn't understand what was happening. Jack pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside without making a sound. Dr. Patterson and the other doctor stopped mid-conversation as they saw him. The room went quiet. Dr. Patterson's eyes narrowed as he looked Jack over, sizing him up in an instant. He was used to dealing with trouble, but this wasn't the kind of trouble he could ignore. Jack didn't waste any time. "What's going on with Maya's chart?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Dr. Patterson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the other doctor, who nervously shifted on his feet. Jack could see the tension in the room, the fear in their eyes. They knew something was wrong. "We're just following protocol," Dr. Patterson said, his tone cool, but there was an edge to his words. "I don't think you should be here, Mr. Harland. This is none of your business." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. "It's my business when a little girl is involved," he said, his voice growing colder. "And it's my business when people like you are covering something up." The tension in the room grew thicker, but Jack didn't back down. He stepped closer to Dr. Patterson, his gaze never leaving the doctor's face. "You don't scare me. And you don't intimidate me," Jack continued. "What you're doing to that girl, to her mother, it stops now." The other doctor, a younger man, glanced nervously toward the door, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Dr. Patterson, on the other hand, stood his ground. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to understand. You're making a mistake." Jack took a deep breath, his eyes still locked on Dr. Patterson. He could feel the weight of the situation settling in, but he couldn't walk away. "Not now. Not when Maya's life was at risk." "I don't care who you're working for," Jack said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect that little girl. And I won't stop until I find out what happened to her mother." The silence in the room was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Dr. Patterson's jaw clenched, and the younger doctor shifted uncomfortably. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, Dr. Patterson spoke again, his voice colder than ever. "You're digging into something that's bigger than you," he warned. "And you're going to regret it." Jack didn't flinch. "You're wrong. I'm not the one who's going to regret this." With that, Jack turned and walked out of the room, leaving Dr. Patterson and his colleagues standing in stunned silence. As he rejoined the little girl in the hallway, Jack's mind raced. The conversation had given him more questions than answers, but it confirmed one thing. Someone was trying to cover something up. Someone who would do whatever it took to keep the truth hidden. Jack knew he was up against more than just a corrupt doctor. This went deeper, much deeper, and he was going to find out just how deep it went. But he wasn't going to do it alone. He turned to the girl, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. "We're going to get your mom back," he promised, his voice soft but filled with determination. The girl smiled, a flicker of hope shining through her fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded, his mind already planning the next move. This was far from over. And now that he was involved, neither the hospital nor anyone else would stop him from finding the truth. Jack and the little girl stood outside the staff lounge, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. His mind raced with the information he had just uncovered. Dr. Patterson, the doctor who had removed Maya's chart, was hiding something, and it was clear that it went beyond just a simple mistake. Jack had known for years that hospitals could be places where the vulnerable were preyed upon, but this felt different. There was a deliberate effort to conceal the truth, and that only made him more determined to get to the bottom of it. He glanced at the little girl beside him, her innocent face etched with worry, and his heart tightened. He had promised her he would protect her mom, and he was going to keep that promise, no matter what it took. He had to move fast. The longer they stayed here, the more dangerous the situation became. They couldn't wait around for answers to come to them. They had to go after the answers themselves. "We're leaving," Jack said softly, looking down at the girl. She nodded, her small hand clutching his jacket again, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. They walked quickly down the hall, Jack's boots echoing in the empty corridor. He didn't know where to start, but he had a feeling that the answers would be hidden within the walls of this hospital. There was something about Dr. Patterson's reaction that told him the doctor wasn't just a part of the conspiracy, he was a key player in it. They reached the elevators, and Jack pressed the button to go down. The little girl glanced up at him, her voice trembling. "Are we going to find my mom?" she asked, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Jack's heart broke a little. She was so young, so vulnerable, and here she was, asking him a question that he didn't have a concrete answer to. "We will," he said firmly, even though he wasn't entirely sure how he was going to pull it off. "I promise you, we're going to get your mom back." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside, Jack hitting the ground floor button. The ride down was silent, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between them. As they reached the lobby, Jack's mind was already working out a plan. He had to get to the records room, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. If Dr. Patterson and his associates were trying to hide something, the hospital staff was likely involved too. The last thing Jack needed was to run into someone who would try to stop him. But he couldn't let that stop him. Not now. They stepped out of the elevator, and Jack led the girl toward the lobby doors. They were almost out when a familiar voice called out behind them. "Mr. Harland." Jack froze. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The tone was cold, authoritative. He slowly turned, his eyes narrowing as he faced the hospital security guard. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice steady but guarded. The guard, a tall man with a square jaw and a stern expression, took a step forward. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave," he said, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Jack felt the girl's small hand tighten in his jacket, and he glanced down at her, trying to offer her some reassurance. But inside, he was already preparing for the worst. "What's going on here?" Jack asked, his voice low, but with a hard edge that suggested he wasn't backing down. The security guard didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, his gaze flickering briefly to the girl before returning to Jack. "You've been asking too many questions," the guard said, his voice taking on a warning tone. "And now, you're going to have to leave." Jack's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a hospital security guard doing his job. This was someone involved in the cover-up, someone who was willing to take drastic measures to protect whatever was going on behind these walls. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice firm, unyielding. "And neither is she." He gestured to the little girl, who was looking up at the guard with wide, frightened eyes. The security guard's hand hovered near his gun, but Jack didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like this before. He knew what they were capable of, but he also knew that he wasn't going to back down. "You're not taking her anywhere," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're not going to stop me from getting answers." The guard took another step forward, but Jack didn't move. He had made a promise to the little girl, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Not now, not ever. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, it felt like everything had come to a standstill. But then, without warning, a voice broke through the silence. "That's enough." Jack turned to see a man in a suit approaching, his expression calm but firm. He was in his mid-40s, with sharp features and dark eyes that held an unmistakable authority. "Let them go," the man said, his voice brokering no argument. The security guard looked at the man, then back at Jack. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he stepped aside. Jack didn't waste time. He took the girl's hand and began to walk past the guard, heading for the doors. As they stepped outside, Jack's mind was racing. This wasn't over. Whoever that man was, he was tied to the same forces that had tried to stop him. And now, Jack knew he was closer than ever to the truth. He had to get to Maya, and he had to do it fast. As Jack and the little girl stepped outside the hospital, the cool night air hit them like a sudden gust, snapping Jack back to reality. He glanced at her, her small hand still clutching his jacket. Her wide eyes looked up at him, filled with hope and fear, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Jack allowed himself to take a breath. The security guard hadn't stopped them, but that didn't mean they were in the clear. He needed to move fast. He turned and looked around, the streets of the city empty and quiet. They were on the edge of town, away from the hospital's main entrance, where the rest of the staff and patients would be. But he couldn't risk taking the little girl back to his bike just yet. They needed a plan. "We need to find out where Maya is," Jack said, his voice steady but urgent. The little girl nodded, her face still pale but filled with a glimmer of trust. She hadn't said much since they left the hospital, but Jack could feel her fear. She needed answers just as much as he did. He couldn't fail her. He glanced down at his phone, searching for any leads, any indication of where Maya had been taken. But there was nothing. The hospital had clearly shut down communication, and there were no reports of Maya's condition online. Jack's mind raced, but as the minutes passed, he felt more and more the weight of the task ahead. He couldn't do this alone. "I need to call some people," Jack muttered, pulling out his phone and quickly dialing a number. A few seconds later, the line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Jack, what's going on?" It was Storm, one of his closest friends in the motorcycle club. Storm's deep voice was full of concern, even through the phone's static. "I need you to track down some information for me," Jack said, his voice low. "Maya's been taken, and something's wrong at the hospital. I need to know where they've moved her." There was a pause on the other end. Jack could hear Storm's breath, steady and calm, as if he were already preparing for whatever task Jack was about to lay out. "Got it," Storm said simply. "I'll get on it right away. You're not alone in this." Jack nodded, grateful for his friend's loyalty. They had ridden together for years, through thick and thin, and Storm had always had his back. "Thanks, Storm," Jack replied. "I'll meet you in the usual spot in an hour. Be ready." As Jack hung up, he turned back to the little girl, who was still standing beside him. "We're going to get your mom back," Jack said, his voice soft but determined. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Do you promise?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's heart tightened. He crouched down in front of her, meeting her eyes with as much strength as he could muster. "I promise," he said firmly. "No one is going to hurt your mom. We'll make sure of it." He reached out and gently patted her shoulder before standing up and checking his surroundings. They were outside the hospital now, but he couldn't stay here for long. The people behind this were powerful, and Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they had erased all evidence of their wrongdoings. He needed to act fast. He looked down at the little girl, taking one last moment to make sure she was okay. "Stay close," Jack said, his voice steady as he started walking. The little girl nodded and followed him, her small steps quick too. Keep up with his long strides. Jack's mind raced as they moved through the quiet streets, away from the hospital and into the dark alleys that led toward the outskirts of town. He could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, but otherwise, the night was silent. Too silent. They passed several empty buildings, their windows boarded up and abandoned, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his instincts telling him that someone was following them. But every time he turned around, the streets remained empty. They had to keep moving. As they neared an old warehouse, Jack spotted a motorcycle parked by the entrance. His pulse quickened. It was Storm. Jack quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. When they reached the motorcycle, Storm stood up from where he had been leaning against the wall. His face was hard, and his eyes scanned the area around them. "We've got a problem," Storm said, his voice low and tense. Jack felt his stomach tighten. "What's going on?" "The hospital has been cleaned up," Storm replied, handing Jack a folder. "I got some inside information, but it's bad news. They've moved Maya, and the whole place is locked down tight. Whoever is behind this has a lot of power." Jack took the folder and opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. The hospital's records had been wiped clean, but Storm had managed to dig up a few pieces of information. Maya had been transferred to a secure facility, one that Jack had never heard of. The name of the place sent a chill down his spine. Redwood Medical. "Redwood Medical?" Jack repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is it?" "I've got the address," Storm replied, his tone grim. "But be careful. This isn't just a hospital. It's a front for something much bigger." Jack clenched his fists. He knew what he had to do. He had to find Maya. He had to get her out of there. And he wasn't going to stop until he did. "Let's go," Jack said, determination hardening in his voice. Storm nodded, and together, they mounted their motorcycles. Jack glanced down at the little girl, who had been quietly watching them. "We're going to find your mom, I swear it," Jack said, his voice firm. She smiled softly, but there was still fear in her eyes. Jack revved his engine, the sound of the motorcycle's roar filling the night air as they sped off toward Redwood Medical. The road ahead was dark, but Jack knew that no matter what he faced, he would not stop until Maya was safe. The night was cold as Jack and Storm revved their motorcycles, the sound of the engines echoing through the quiet streets. The city was behind them now, and ahead lay the unknown, Redwood Medical. Jack's mind raced as they sped through the dark, the little girl sitting behind him clutching onto his waist, her small hands trembling but her resolve growing with each passing mile. The road stretched out before them, the only light coming from the moon and the occasional street lamp. Jack's heart pounded, not just from the speed, but from the weight of what they were about to face. Every mile brought them closer to the facility that held Maya, and every second felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. Storm led the way, his motorcycle cutting through the darkness like a shadow. Jack followed closely, eyes scanning the road ahead. He had a feeling that Redwood Medical wasn't just a place for healing. It was a fortress, a place where people went in but never came out. And Maya was trapped inside. The silence between the two riders was heavy. Neither of them spoke, but both were thinking the same thing. This wasn't going to be easy. As they neared their destination, Jack's gut twisted with a sense of dread. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of feeling that came when you knew something was wrong, but you didn't have all the answers yet. The facility loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the skyline. It was massive, an imposing structure that seemed to absorb the light around it. The closer they got, the more Jack's unease grew. They pulled up to the gate, which was guarded by two men in dark uniforms. Their eyes followed the bikers as they approached, but they didn't make a move to stop them. Storm slowed his bike to a stop, and Jack did the same, taking a deep breath before swinging his leg over the seat. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Storm looked at him, his expression hard. "We need to get inside," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with concern. Jack nodded. He had no idea how they were going to get past the guards, but he wasn't going to waste time trying to reason with them. Maya was in there, and he wasn't leaving without her. He turned to the little girl, who was standing next to him now, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're getting your mom back." She nodded, her small hand gripping his jacket tightly. Jack took a step toward the gate, and Storm followed, his eyes scanning the area. The guards watched them carefully, but they didn't make a move. Jack could feel the weight of their stares, but he didn't flinch. He had come too far to turn back now. As they reached the gate, one of the guards stepped forward. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Jack didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "We're here to see Maya Jenkins," he said, his voice calm but firm. The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the other guard, who gave a slight nod. "She's not available right now," the guard said, his tone colder now. Jack didn't back down. "We know she's here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And we're not leaving without her." The guard hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the facility. "You'll have to go through the proper channels," he said, his tone more dismissive now. "We're not authorized to let anyone in without clearance." Jack's patience was wearing thin. He had already been through too much, and now he was being stalled by a pair of guards who didn't care about Maya's life. He stepped closer to the gate, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Listen, I don't care about your clearance. I'm taking her, and you're not going to stop me." The guard's expression hardened, but he didn't move. "You're making a mistake," he warned, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. Jack didn't flinch. "No," he said, his voice cold. "The mistake was thinking you could stop me." Just as Jack was about to make his move, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared from behind them. He turned to see another rider approaching, this one moving quickly. The guard's eyes flickered toward the new arrival, and Jack took advantage of the moment of distraction. He lunged forward, grabbing the gate and shoving it open with a force that surprised both guards. Storm was right behind him, his eyes fierce and focused as they pushed forward. The guards shouted, but it was too late. Jack and Storm were already inside, moving quickly toward the building. The little girl ran beside Jack, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the facility. They didn't stop to look back. They couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. The inside of the building was just as cold and sterile as Jack had imagined. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the hallways. They passed empty rooms, their doors closed, and Jack's gut twisted with each step. This place was too quiet, too empty. It felt like a trap. They rounded a corner and came face to face with another set of guards. This time, they didn't hesitate. Storm charged forward, knocking one of the guards aside with a swift move, while Jack tackled the other to the ground. The little girl stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear, but Jack didn't let go of her hand. "Keep moving," he urged, his voice tight with urgency. They ran down the hallway, ignoring the shouts of the guards behind them. Jack could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, pushing him forward. Maya was close. He could feel it. They reached a large set of double doors, and Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked them open, and there, lying on the bed, was Maya. She was unconscious, hooked up to a series of machines, but she was alive. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to her side, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The little girl stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom!" she cried, running to her mother's side. Jack knelt beside her, his eyes locked on Maya. He knew they didn't have much time. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder. They were out of time. Jack's heart raced as he knelt beside Maya's bed, his eyes scanning the room with sharp focus. The little girl, still trembling, stood frozen in the doorway, unable to believe that her mother was finally here, alive, and breathing. The sound of footsteps grew louder in the hallway, and Jack's pulse quickened. He knew they didn't have much time before more guards or worse, whoever was orchestrating this operation, arrived. He looked at Maya, still unconscious, her body frail and hooked to machines. The sight of her lying there, so vulnerable, fueled his anger. Whoever had done this to her would pay. Jack stood up, motioning for the little girl to come closer. She walked slowly, unsure, as if still not fully grasping that her mother was alive and just within reach. Jack could feel her fear and confusion, but there was no time to explain. "We need to move, now," he said, his voice firm. The girl nodded, her face still pale but with a flicker of hope in her eyes. Jack glanced toward the door, his mind calculating the risks. There was no way they could just walk out of here. They were deep inside the facility, and the guards would be on high alert. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, the urgency of their situation sinking in. Jack moved to the bed, checking Maya's vitals quickly. Her pulse was weak, but steady. She was alive. He wasn't going to let her slip away now. "Storm," Jack called, his voice low but commanding. Storm stepped into the room, his eyes scanning for any threats. "We've got company," Jack said. "We can't stay here." Storm nodded, his face grim. "What's the plan?" Jack didn't hesitate. He had a plan, but it was risky. "We get her out of here. Now." Storm moved quickly to Maya's side, carefully disconnecting her from the machines, and Jack did the same, making sure they wouldn't leave any trace of their presence. They couldn't afford to leave behind any evidence that could lead to their capture. "Grab her," Jack said, as he lifted Maya into his arms. Storm helped the little girl onto his back, and together, they moved quietly toward the exit. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, but Jack's instincts told him they weren't alone. The guards would be patrolling soon. They had to be quick. The air was thick with tension as they moved down the sterile corridor, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Jack glanced over his shoulder to make sure the little girl was still behind him, clutching onto Storm. They rounded the corner, and Jack froze. At the far end of the hallway stood two security guards, their backs turned as they spoke to each other. Jack held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. They couldn't be spotted. He motioned for Storm to stay still, and for what felt like an eternity, they stood in the shadows, waiting for the guards to pass. The seconds stretched out. The guards laughed, unaware of the danger just a few feet away. Jack's hand tightened on the gun holstered at his waist, but he didn't draw it yet. Not unless he had to. Finally, the guards turned and walked in the opposite direction, their conversation fading as they rounded the corner. Jack exhaled sharply, his heart still racing. "Move," he whispered urgently. They continued down the hallway, keeping to the shadows, careful not to make a sound. Jack's mind raced with the growing realization that time was running out. They were so close to getting out, but they still had to get past the main entrance and out of the building without being caught. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay undetected. As they neared the exit, Jack saw a security checkpoint ahead. Two more guards were standing by the door, checking ID badges as employees passed through. Jack's stomach twisted. They couldn't go through there, not with Maya in his arms. The girl could only hold on for so long before they would be forced to make a move. "We need a distraction," Jack said under his breath. Storm looked around, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a fire alarm on the wall. He gave Jack a nod. "I'll do it," Storm said. "You get her to safety." Jack nodded, trusting Storm completely. Storm walked casually toward the fire alarm, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. With a quick motion, he pulled the lever, and the building was immediately filled with the sound of sirens and flashing red lights. The security guards jumped, startled by the sudden emergency. Jack didn't wait. With the guards distracted, he rushed forward, moving as quickly as he could while still being careful not to draw attention. He reached the exit and pulled open the door, stepping into the cool night air. The sound of the fire alarm echoed behind them, but it was quickly drowned out by the roar of their motorcycles waiting outside. Jack's heart pounded as they moved toward the bikes, but they weren't safe yet. He glanced around, making sure no one was following them. The little girl clung to his side, her eyes wide with fear, but also with hope. They were free, but for how long? They hadn't made it out of the woods yet. Storm followed closely behind, his motorcycle ready. "Get on," Jack said, motioning to the little girl. She didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the bike, holding on tight as Jack started the engine. The sound of the motorcycle roaring to life filled the air, and Jack didn't waste any time. They sped off into the night, leaving Redwood Medical behind them. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was determined. He had made a promise to get Maya out of there, and he wasn't about to break it. They would keep moving, no matter what. The roar of the motorcycles filled the night air as Jack and Storm sped down the dark highway, the cool wind whipping past them. The little girl clung tightly to Jack, her small hands gripping his waist as they moved swiftly through the night, the sound of the engines echoing through the empty streets. Jack's mind raced with the uncertainty of what was ahead. They had gotten out of Redwood Medical, but they weren't safe yet. Every mile felt like a step closer to freedom, but it also brought them closer to whoever was chasing them. The fire alarm had bought them some time, but it was only a matter of time before they realized Maya was gone. Jack glanced at Storm, who was riding just ahead. His face was set, focused, and Jack knew that Storm had been through too much not to understand the gravity of the situation. The little girl had barely spoken since they left the hospital. Jack didn't know what was going through her mind, but he knew that she must be terrified. She had just been separated from her mother, who was still unconscious, and everything had happened so fast. Jack's mind drifted back to the moment when he had lifted Maya from the bed. Her frail body, hooked to machines, had looked so vulnerable, and now they were racing against time to save her. He couldn't afford to stop. He couldn't afford to fail her. As they drove through the night, Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled over to the side of the road, signaling for Storm to do the same. Jack pulled the phone from his pocket, glancing at the screen. It was a message from one of his contacts. "Redwood Medical. They've called in the cavalry. They know she's gone." Jack's stomach dropped. The cavalry? He had a feeling that whoever was behind this wasn't just some shady doctors. There was a larger force at play, and they were coming for them. He looked at Storm, his face grim. "We've got trouble," Jack said, showing him the message. Storm didn't need an explanation. He could see the tension in Jack's eyes. "How far are we from the safe house?" Jack asked. "About an hour," Storm replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "We need to keep moving." Jack nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. They weren't going to make it to the safe house without a fight. He had to make sure Maya was protected, no matter the cost. He revved the engine, and they continued down the road. The little girl clung to Jack even tighter, her grip showing the fear she was still holding in. Jack glanced back at her, trying to reassure her with a smile. "We're almost there," he said, his voice calm, but the weight of their situation still hung heavy in the air. The road stretched on, a long, dark ribbon in the night. They passed the familiar sights of the small towns, the neon lights flickering in the distance. Jack knew they had to stay ahead of whoever was coming for them. He had no idea how big the operation behind this was, but it was clear they had eyes everywhere. As they neared a curve in the road, Jack's headlights flashed on something in the distance. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. A car? No, it wasn't a car. It was a black SUV parked on the side of the road, just out of sight. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time he had seen a car like that, and he didn't like the feeling it gave him. The SUV was far enough off the road that it looked like it had been parked there for a while, but the headlights were still on, casting a long shadow on the pavement. Jack's instincts kicked in. "Get down," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. He didn't wait for Storm to respond, already pulling off to the side of the road and ducking behind a thick cluster of trees. Storm followed without question, moving quickly to the cover of the trees. They crouched low, their bikes hidden in the darkness. Jack's eyes never left the SUV. "Who do you think they are?" Storm whispered, his voice tight with concern. "I don't know," Jack muttered. "But we can't afford to take chances." They stayed hidden, watching as the SUV's headlights flickered, and then, to their horror, the sound of another vehicle approaching from behind. Jack's grip tightened on the gun holstered at his side. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he was ready for it. As the second vehicle came closer, Jack could make out the faint sound of tires on gravel, but he didn't dare move. The tension in the air was suffocating. The car passed them by, its headlights casting long shadows as it moved slowly down the road. But Jack wasn't fooled. He knew they were being followed. Storm's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think they've spotted us?" Jack shook his head, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "Not yet. But they will. We need to move." They waited for what felt like an eternity, but when the SUV finally passed them, they didn't waste any time. Jack and Storm quickly got on their bikes, revving the engines as quietly as they could. They knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. As they pulled back onto the road, Jack felt his pulse quicken. They had to outrun whoever was following them. Maya was counting on them, and Jack wasn't about to let her down. The road ahead was still dark, but the light of dawn was starting to creep over the horizon. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the glow in the sky signaled that they didn't have much time. They had to get to the safe house before it was too late. Jack's mind raced as they sped through the night, the sound of their motorcycles the only thing breaking the silence. There was no going back now. The sound of the motorcycles thundered through the quiet countryside, the road stretching out ahead, like an endless ribbon of asphalt. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the urgency of the situation mounting with each passing second. He had promised to protect Maya, to get her out of the danger that had been closing in on her from every angle. And now, he was closer than ever to keeping that promise. But he knew that the clock was ticking. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, and Jack could feel the weight of every decision weighing heavily on him. They had been on the run for hours, but they weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. The facility, Redwood Medical, was just up ahead, and Jack knew that getting in and out without attracting attention was going to be the hardest part. They couldn't afford to be seen, not now. The little girl, still clinging to Jack's back, had barely spoken since they left. Her silence weighed on him, her fear obvious in the way she held on to him so tightly. Jack didn't know what she was thinking, but he could see the questions in her eyes, the same questions he was asking himself. What were they up against? Who was behind this? As they neared the facility, Jack's mind raced with possibilities. He had no idea what they would find when they got inside. Was Maya really the only target, or were they planning something bigger? Whatever it was, Jack knew they couldn't wait any longer. He had to get in, get Maya, and get out before it was too late. Storm pulled up alongside Jack, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "This is it," Storm said, his voice low. "We're almost there." Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the throttle. "We move fast. We can't waste any time." Storm gave him a quick nod, his expression grim. "Got it." They both revved their engines, their motorcycles roaring to life as they accelerated down the final stretch of road. As they approached the entrance to Redwood Medical, Jack's eyes flicked to the security gate ahead. There were 2 guards standing by the entrance, but they weren't looking their way. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was their chance. Without slowing down, Jack swerved to the side, pulling his bike off the main road and into a patch of trees that lined the perimeter of the facility. Storm followed closely behind, and they both cut their engines, coasting quietly through the underbrush until they were hidden from sight. Jack could feel the tension in the air, his pulse quickening as they got closer to the entrance. They weren't far now. With one quick motion, he dismounted his bike and crouched low, signaling for Storm and the little girl to follow. The little girl, clutching Jack's jacket, looked up at him, her face full of uncertainty. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to get your mom. Just trust me." She nodded, her grip tightening on his jacket, and Jack led the way, moving silently through the trees. As they neared the back of the facility, Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. The sounds of the motorcycles faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic sounds of his own breath and the rustling of leaves beneath his feet. He had done everything he could to stay calm, but now that they were so close, the weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. The back entrance was only a few yards away, and Jack could see the security cameras watching over the area. But they weren't looking at the ground. They weren't looking at them. Jack motioned for Storm to follow him, and they ducked low, moving quickly toward the door. He could feel his adrenaline surging as they reached the back entrance. The door was locked, but Jack was ready for that. He pulled out a small set of tools from his jacket pocket, his fingers working quickly to pick the lock. Seconds felt like hours as he twisted the lock, but finally, with a soft click, the door swung open. Jack motioned for the little girl to stay behind him, and they slipped inside. The air inside was cool and sterile, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. Jack's heart raced as he moved down the hallway, Storm close behind. They couldn't afford to be caught now. The girl stayed close to Jack, her hand gripping his sleeve as they moved silently through the building. Jack's mind raced as he looked for any signs of Maya. He knew she had to be here somewhere, but where? The hallway stretched out ahead of them, and Jack's eyes flicked to the doors lining the walls. He had no idea which room she was in, but he knew he had to find her fast. As they passed one of the rooms, Jack's ears perked up at the sound of muffled voices. He motioned for Storm to stop, and they listened. The voices were coming from a room just ahead. Jack's instincts kicked in. He turned to Storm, his voice low but firm. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to check it out." Storm nodded, his eyes focused on the hallway. Jack moved quietly down the corridor, careful not to make a sound. As he reached the door, he paused, listening. The voices were louder now, and Jack could make out a few words. "She's still alive," one of the voices said. "But we need to move her before they find out." Jack's heart skipped a beat. They were talking about Maya. He had to act quickly. With a deep breath, Jack pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, and for a moment, Jack couldn't make out anything. But then he saw her. Maya was lying on the bed, unconscious, her body covered in bruises and cuts. Jack's stomach churned at the sight of her, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He had to get her out of here. He rushed to her side, his heart racing. He could hear the voices coming closer, but there was no turning back now. Jack moved swiftly into the room, his heart pounding as he approached Maya's bedside. She looked so fragile, her skin pale and bruised, her breathing shallow. The sight of her in such a state made his blood boil. Whoever had done this to her had to pay. He could hear the voices of the men outside the room, growing louder as they approached. Jack's mind raced, but he didn't have much time. He kneeled beside Maya, checking her vitals. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her body was covered in various medical tubes, each one seemingly tethered to her life. He couldn't let her stay here another minute. He gently placed a hand on her forehead, brushing back the strands of hair that clung to her sweaty skin. "Maya," he whispered, his voice soft but urgent. "We're getting you out of here." As he spoke, the sound of footsteps in the hallway grew closer. Jack quickly turned, scanning the room for any way to escape. The door was the only exit, but if they stayed here, they would be caught. He looked back down at Maya. "We don't have much time," he muttered under his breath. He was about to reach for the four-drip when he heard a faint voice calling out from the doorway. "What the hell are you doing?" Jack's heart skipped a beat as he turned to face the new threat. Standing in the doorway was one of the doctors, his arms crossed, and his eyes narrowing as he studied Jack. The doctor was tall, wearing a white coat and looking every bit the part of someone who thought they were untouchable. "I'm taking her," Jack said coldly, his voice firm. "She's not staying here." The doctor's eyes flickered to Maya, then back to Jack, a smirk forming on his lips. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her?" he sneered. "You're not leaving with her. Not while I'm here." Jack didn't flinch. He stepped in front of Maya's bed, blocking the doctor's view of her. "I'm not asking for permission," he said, his voice icy. "I'm taking her, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." The doctor's expression darkened, his posture shifting as he straightened up. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled, taking a step toward Jack. "You think you can walk in here and take her from me? From us? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Jack's hand went to his waist, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his gun. He wasn't here to start a fight, but if it came down to it, he wasn't going to hesitate. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "And I'm not leaving without her." The doctor took another step forward, clearly trying to intimidate Jack. But Jack stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, neither of them moved. But then, just as Jack was about to make his move, there was a loud crash from the hallway. The doctor turned his head, and Jack seized the opportunity. He grabbed Maya's four-pole, wheeling it toward the door as quickly as he could. "Stay close," he muttered to the little girl, who had been standing quietly by the side of the bed, her eyes wide with fear. She nodded, following Jack as he moved out of the room and into the hallway. The crash from earlier was followed by a flurry of footsteps, and Jack's instincts told him they were being followed. He didn't have time to look back. He had to get Maya out of the facility and fast. The hallway was empty for now, but Jack knew they wouldn't stay that way for long. He pushed the door open, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Just as he stepped out into the hallway, a security guard rounded the corner, his eyes locking onto Jack. Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his body language sending a clear message. He wasn't stopping. The guard shouted, but Jack was already moving, pushing the four-pole in front of him and shoving the guard aside. The guard stumbled, but he regained his balance and lunged at Jack. But Jack was faster. He grabbed the guard by the collar and shoved him hard against the wall, knocking the wind out of him. "Stay down," Jack growled, not taking his eyes off the hallway. He could hear more footsteps coming from behind him. He didn't know how many were after them, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. He glanced at Storm, who was coming up behind him, and gave him a nod. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice urgent. "Let's move." The little girl followed closely behind Jack, her small hand gripping his sleeve as they moved quickly down the hallway. They had to be fast. They had to be silent. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind focused entirely on getting Maya out of there. The hallway stretched on, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glow on the sterile walls. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the pressure building as they approached the main exit. They were almost there. Jack's hand tightened on the four-pole as he pushed through another set of doors. The outside world was just beyond them, but so were their pursuers. He could hear the guards shouting from behind them, getting closer with every passing second. "Hurry," Jack said, pushing the door open. "We need to move. Now." They stepped outside into the cool air, the dark sky above them only slightly brighter from the first light of dawn. Jack's heart was still racing, but they weren't out of danger yet. He could hear the sound of motorcycles in the distance, the roar of engines that sent a chill down his spine. They were coming. The early morning sky was still dark, but the faintest glimmer of dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. Jack and Storm pushed forward, their footsteps echoing on the empty pavement as they raced toward the motorcycles. Behind them, the sound of shouting guards grew louder, the realization that they were about to be surrounded sinking in. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. They had to keep moving, and fast. The little girl, still clutching Jack's sleeve, looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything, but Jack could feel the tension in her small frame. He squeezed her hand, trying to offer comfort, but he knew they had no time for hesitation. They reached the bikes, and Jack quickly mounted his, starting the engine. Storm did the same, his face hard with determination. "Stay close," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. The little girl climbed onto the back of Jack's bike, holding on tightly as they revved their engines and sped down the road. Jack's eyes scanned the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of pursuit. He didn't know how much longer they could stay ahead of whoever was coming for them, but he wasn't about to stop. The sound of engines revving in the distance caught Jack's attention. He glanced over his shoulder, his pulse quickening. They were closing in. Jack pushed the throttle harder, the bike surging forward as the road stretched out before them. The little girl clung to him, her small body pressed against his back as they weaved through the winding road. He could hear the roar of the pursuing motorcycles getting louder, and Jack knew it wouldn't be long before they caught up. They had to shake them. "Hold on tight," Jack shouted to the little girl, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. She nodded, gripping him tighter as they sped around another curve. Jack's mind raced, calculating their next move. They had to get to the highway. They needed the open road, where they could outrun whoever was after them. But first, they had to lose them. Jack took a sharp turn, cutting through a narrow alley between two buildings. He could hear the screech of tires behind them as the pursuers followed suit, but Jack was ahead. He knew the city streets, and he knew how to lose them. The alley led to a small park, and Jack aimed for the narrow exit, the path ahead barely wide enough for his bike to fit through. He pushed the bike to its limits, the tires scraping against the uneven pavement. He glanced back once more, seeing the headlights of the pursuing motorcycles getting closer, but they were still a little too far behind. They had to get out of this tight spot. Jack sped up, the exit of the park coming into view. But just as he thought they were clear, a shadow appeared in front of him. Another motorcycle, blocking their path. Jack slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as he fought to keep control. He could see the figure on the motorcycle now, a tall man in a black leather jacket. The man grinned, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "Not so fast," the man shouted, revving his engine. Jack's instincts flared. He knew they weren't going to let him pass without a fight. The little girl's grip tightened on Jack as she looked over his shoulder. Jack didn't have time to think. He twisted the throttle and shot forward, narrowly missing the man on the motorcycle. The man swerved to follow, but Jack was already ahead, his heart pounding in his chest as he weaved through the trees and park benches. He could hear the man behind him, getting closer, but Jack wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let anyone stop him from getting Maya to safety. Jack took another sharp turn, heading toward the main street. The roar of the pursuing motorcycle was growing louder, but Jack knew he had to keep his focus. They were almost there. He could see the streetlights up ahead, and he knew once they hit the main road, they could outrun their pursuers. Jack glanced at Storm, who was right behind him. "We need to hit the main road," Jack shouted over his shoulder. Storm nodded, and without another word, the two of them sped toward the street. The little girl clung to Jack's back, her eyes wide with fear, but Jack knew they were almost there. The main road loomed in the distance, a straight stretch where they could finally break free from the chase. Jack's hands were steady on the handlebars as they neared the intersection, but just as they were about to make the turn onto the main road, another motorcycle appeared, cutting them off. Jack slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. This time, they had no choice but to face the pursuers head-on. The figure on the motorcycle in front of them revved the engine, blocking the road completely. "You think you can just take off with her?" the man shouted, his voice full of malice. Jack's mind raced, his fingers tightening around the handlebars. He could see the other pursuers closing in from behind, and there was no way out. He had no choice. "Get ready," Jack said to the little girl, his voice calm despite the chaos. He glanced at Storm, who was ready for whatever came next. The man in front of them grinned, but Jack wasn't about to back down. He had one option left. He twisted the throttle and shot forward, aiming straight for the man's bike. The man barely had time to react as Jack swerved at the last second, narrowly missing him but forcing him to veer off course. The move worked. Jack and Storm took the opening, speeding through the gap and onto the main road. The pursuers were still behind them, but now they had a lead. Jack's heart was pounding as they sped down the open road, the headlights of the motorcycles in the distance. He could see the highway up ahead, but they weren't out of danger yet. He had to keep going. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. The little girl clung to him, her grip tighter than ever. They had one chance to escape, and Jack wasn't going to let it slip away. The roar of the motorcycles echoed in the cool morning air as Jack and Storm tore down the open road, the little girl clinging tightly to Jack's back. Their speed was their only advantage, but Jack knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. The headlights of the motorcycles in the distance grew larger. With each passing second, they were closing in. Jack's hands tightened on the handlebars, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, calculating their next move. They had only seconds before the pursuers caught up, and he had to think fast. The main road ahead stretched out like a highway to freedom, but Jack knew the facility they had just escaped from would be sending reinforcements soon. The little girl was still holding on to Jack, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her fear palpable. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He couldn't let anything happen to Maya. He shot a glance over his shoulder, seeing the silhouettes of the motorcycles growing ever closer. They had to make a choice, fight or flee. Jack glanced at Storm, who was riding close behind him, his face set with determination. Storm wasn't going to back down. Neither was Jack. "We're not running anymore," Jack muttered, his voice tight with resolve. Storm nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Jack pushed the throttle forward, the bike surging with renewed power as they sped into a sharp turn, cutting through the curve in the road like a knife. The pursuers followed, but Jack could tell they were starting to fall behind. It wasn't much, but it gave them a moment of respite. The next few miles were crucial. Jack knew they had to take the high ground, figuratively and literally. He had one shot at this. He could hear the hum of the engines behind them, and the pressure was building. He needed to get ahead. As the road began to rise, Jack could see a hill up ahead, just the kind of terrain that would allow them to use their bikes to their advantage. The hill was steep, and the sharp incline would make it difficult for the pursuers to follow. It was the perfect opportunity. "Storm, take the left," Jack called out, his voice urgent. Storm nodded and cut his bike to the left, following Jack's lead as they charged toward the hill. The little girl gasped, her grip tightening around Jack as they surged up the incline. It was a gamble. They didn't know what waited for them at the top, but Jack had no choice. They had to make it. The climb was treacherous, the road narrow and uneven, but Jack and Storm were skilled riders, and they made it look easy as they scaled the hill, the sound of the engines roaring in the still morning air. The motorcycles behind them struggled to keep up, their engines sputtering as they tried to follow the steep incline. Jack glanced over his shoulder, seeing the pursuers falter, unable to make the climb as easily as they had. But it wasn't over yet. They still had to get out of this, and the top of the hill was just the beginning. As they reached the summit, Jack's eyes scanned the landscape ahead, looking for their next move. He could see a stretch of road far off in the distance, and beyond that, a dense forest. If they could make it to that road, they might just be able to shake their pursuers for good. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. The little girl, still clutching him tightly, whispered, "Where are we going?" Jack glanced down at her, his heart softening for a moment. "We're going to keep you safe," he said, his voice steady but filled with promise. They reached the peak of the hill, and Jack gunned the engine, racing toward the distant road. Storm followed closely behind, their bikes kicking up dust as they surged forward. But as they neared the road, Jack's heart skipped a beat. Another motorcycle appeared at the bottom of the hill, its headlights cutting through the dark, signaling that their escape wasn't as easy as they thought. The pursuers had regrouped. "We need to get to that road now," Jack shouted, his voice filled with urgency. He pushed the throttle forward, taking the lead as they descended the hill, the roar of the engines deafening in the open space. The road ahead grew closer, but Jack knew they couldn't wait for it to reach them. They had to force the issue. As they neared the bottom of the hill, Jack spotted a sharp bend in the road, just ahead. He had one more trick up his sleeve. He leaned into the curve, his motorcycle responding to his every move as they hurtled toward the turn. The little girl clung tightly to his back, her small hands gripping him with all her strength. Jack knew he couldn't let her down now. They reached the bend, and Jack cut the wheel, drifting smoothly into the turn, his bike kicking up gravel as they made the sharp corner. The pursuing motorcycle followed, but they were too close to the edge. Jack could hear the tires screech as the pursuer lost control, slipping off the road and into the dirt. The man on the bike swore as his motorcycle tipped, but he was too far behind now. Jack didn't stop to look back. He gunned the engine again, pushing the bike harder as they neared the safety of the road. The open highway stretched ahead of them, and Jack could finally breathe a little easier. But his mind never stopped moving. There was still danger ahead. There would always be danger as long as they were on the run. But for now, they were free. He glanced at Storm, who gave him a quick nod. The little girl, still holding on tight, whispered, "Thank you." Jack didn't answer immediately, but his heart warmed at the words. "We're not done yet," he said quietly, his eyes on the road ahead. "But we're one step closer." And for the first time since this nightmare had started, Jack felt a flicker of hope. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop until they had Maya safe, no matter what it took. The sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance as Jack and Storm continued down the open highway, the wind rushing past them. The little girl, still holding on to Jack, had fallen silent, her small body pressed against his back. She had been through so much already, and now, they were finally on their way to safety. Jack's mind raced, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. They had made it this far. They had outrun the danger, for now. But he knew that they weren't truly free yet. There were still many questions left unanswered. Who was behind all of this? Why was Maya being targeted? And most importantly, who else would they have to face to make sure she was safe? The sun had begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the horizon. It was a new day, and with it, a new chance to find the answers. Jack had promised to protect the little girl and her mother, and he would keep that promise no matter what. He glanced over at Storm, who was riding beside him. "We're not done yet," Jack said, his voice steady. Storm nodded, his face grim but resolute. I know, he replied. But we're one step closer. We got them out. That's what matters right now. Jack nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. It was true. They had gotten Maya and the little girl out of the immediate danger, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He wasn't sure how far the reach of the people behind this conspiracy went, but he knew they wouldn't stop. Not until they had finished what they had started. What's our next move? Storm asked, pulling up next to Jack. Jack thought for a moment. We need to lay low for a while, he said. Get to a safe place, regroup, and figure out what's really going on. You think they'll come after us again? Storm asked. Jack didn't hesitate. I know they will, he said, his voice firm. But we'll be ready for them. As they rode on, the road stretching out before them, Jack's thoughts returned to Maya. She was still unconscious, and Jack could only hope that the worst was behind them. He had seen too much suffering in his life, but the sight of Maya, frail and vulnerable, had shaken him to his core. He couldn't let her down, not after everything she had been through. They had made it this far, but Jack knew that they had to keep moving forward. They couldn't stop until they had answers, and he wouldn't rest until Maya was truly safe. As the miles passed, Jack's mind wandered to the future. What would happen to Maya and the little girl once they were safe? What kind of life would they have now, after everything that had happened? He didn't have the answers, but he would fight for them, for their future. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the journey heavy on his shoulders. But he couldn't afford to stop now. They still had a long road ahead of them, one that would take them through danger and uncertainty. But Jack wasn't afraid. He had made a promise, and he would keep it. As they approached a small town on the horizon, Jack felt a sense of resolve settle within him. They had made it through the worst, but they weren't done yet. The fight was far from over. And no matter what came next, Jack would be ready. He had to be. The little girl stirred slightly, her small hand squeezing Jack's jacket. Jack glanced back at her, a smile tugging at his lips despite the seriousness of the situation. We're almost there, he said softly, his voice warm. She smiled back at him, the faintest glimmer of hope in her eyes. Jack's heart swelled with pride. He had promised to protect her, and he had kept that promise. But the road to safety was still long. He knew there would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. But for now, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack and Storm rode on, their engines roaring through the quiet morning air. The town was close now, and with it, a temporary refuge from the chaos they had left behind. Jack wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop until Maya and the little girl were safe, and he had the answers he was looking for. Whatever it took, he would see this through to the end. They had survived the storm, but there was still a long road ahead, and Jack would be ready for whatever came next.